Hello, Internet. I'm Andrew.
I'm Mike.
And we are shallow and pedantic. And the reason we call ourselves that is no good reason.
No good reason.
No good reason. All right, good. We have been putting together a literary mag online called Unnamed Journal for what is it?
Almost 3 years?
Almost 3 years. We're in our 4th volume. And when we wanted to come up, it started out as a joke, right? I texted you and was like, you want to put together a sarcastic literary magazine? And we both just finished grad school, and we were both like, that is the best idea ever.
Yep.
So we started doing that, and it was like, we need to come up with a publishing name for this, like to put on the
masthead.
On the masthead, and I was just like, Shallow and Pedantic Publishing?
We were like, yes!
Yes! Let's do that! That sounds good. So now we're turning that into a podcast. This is a serious podcast about unimportant things, where we're going to talk about everything literary, cultural, and everything else that interests us.
Absolutely.
So, we're going to do 2 of those things tonight to start us off, and the first thing is comic books and movies, and why they shouldn't mix.
I think sometimes you can have comic book movies that actually work very, very well, and there are other times where they, well, definitely do not.
They do not. I think you can have comic book characters that make movies. Like all those Marvel movies, they seem to work as big tent popcorn movies. I only saw like a couple. Like I saw the first Iron Man.
That was a good one.
And every Marvel movie that I've seen, I've liked, but I've never cared because I didn't read a lot of Marvel comics as a kid. But I don't, this isn't hating. I'm just like, they make good tentpole movies.
Oh, sure.
They work. People really like them. But I think when you try to make a comic book into a film, that's where you have problems.
Right, when you try to do a straight adaptation, and I mean, I'm not the first person to say this, but the modern template for a comic book movie goes back to Tim Burton's Batman in like '89, I think, and that was a huge success. And there were elements that he drew from the comic, but there's no actual comic that Tim Burton was trying to actually shoot.
That's what I'm saying. It's like, you can take Batman and turn him into a movie, and it's obvious.
Right.
Superheroes, comic book heroes, they're made to make movies out of them because they're larger than life. They belong on the big screen. But I think when you try to, like, if you were to try to, like, tell, like, The Dark Knight Returns.
Right. Yeah, we're going to do a faithful frame-for-frame adaptation of The Dark Knight Returns, and
instead you end up Batman v Superman.
Right.
You know what? You know what annoys me? Everyone talked about that scene from Batman v Superman, and you've never seen this before, this is what everyone wants to see. It's like, it's literally the same suit as Dark Knight Returns, and everyone pretended like that didn't exist. But they weren't trying to make Dark Knight Returns, but they borrowed that scene, and then they fucked it up.
Pretty much, yeah. And the ironic part to me about that was, if you go back and you watch Tim Burton's, first Batman movie, it's pretty fucking obvious that he read The Dark Knight Returns.
Sure.
Like,
all the dark late 80s stuff is there. Like, Gotham City looks like New York looked in the late 80s.
Right, no, it does. So I think, you can have the influences, but I think, it's pretty rare when you actually, they're pretty rare instances where somebody actually does a completely faithful adaptation of a comic book, frame for frame. Like, one that does spring to mind is Sin City, just the first one, definitely not the second one.
What went wrong with the second one? Because I feel like they were using stories from the comic books in the second one. In fact, I don't remember it. I only watched it once and it was like on in the background.
Yeah.
I remember there was the chick and the house and it made me think of Archer, but it wasn't funny.
Yeah. Well, there was that was an example of them. I think where Sin City 2 went wrong was there was, material that they actually tried to write for the movie based on, the material, which, Actually, that's usually how you want to do it.
Sure.
You want to adapt it for the medium of film. But I think everyone was on pins, essentially expecting just the amazingness of the first film, and that is not what they that is not what they received in the second. There was a bunch of material that never existed that they wrote for the film that just was substandard.
Right. I think part of the problem is with Sin City is like it all inhabits the same universe, but there's like no continuity. And there doesn't need to be. Like,
right.
You see Marv die, but then Marv is in like 6 different other stories. Like, does he fit? Is it aware? Is this before? Is this after? It doesn't really matter because it's all Sin City and it's all the same universe. But I think that kind of seeing Marv again in the second movie, even though I know that the comic books do that, kind of diminished everything.
Well, yeah, and they jump around chronologically, and I mean, there were parts, about half of that movie worked, and that was actually the half where they did do a faithful adaptation. But it's pretty rare, and I mean, so that's I like Sin City because it's sort of the example of how you can actually do this right, but most of the time you're just really better off using like you said, using the characters and then just trying to adapt them for the big screen.
Sin City, like, I think the fact that they were able to make a movie that looked like the comic book with that noir black and white was so visually compelling. People just jumped all over it.
Oh no, it was amazing. Yeah,
because it looked just like it, and it told the same stories. And I think to retread it, and I think a lot of the second movie just felt like a retread.
Yeah, there was that, and I mean, I think it's also hard to it's hard to do a sequel even in movie franchises, let alone comic book movie franchises. So people want bigger and better. They want the sequel to surpass the original, and that just wasn't going to happen.
Does the sequel ever surpass the original? They always say that it does, but does it ever?
Rarely.
And I think it's because unless there's more story to tell,
right?
Why have a sequel?
The only example I can think of where the sequel surpasses the original is The Empire Strikes Back.
Well,
sorry,
right. That's a great one to go to. That's everybody's go-to.
But that's the exception, not the rule.
Right. There has to be more story to tell. If there's not more story, they're either gonna like do a complete and total retread, like The Hangover Part 2.
Right.
Or they're gonna make up a bunch of stuff that's gonna screw up the continuity and like undercut the first one.
Right.
Like, I think my go-to, the one for how to make a sequel and milk the original and still do its own thing, is Back to the Future.
Oh, sure, yeah. No, absolutely.
Because that was like 5 years later they did that.
Right.
And they set it up for a sequel, but they never did it.
Right.
And if they'd never made the sequels, I don't think anyone would have minded. But what Back to the Future 2 does that I absolutely love is that it jumps around all over the place. It like really gets into that whole concept of time travel is really a terrible idea.
Yeah.
Which I like, because I hate time travel as a plot concept. Like, every time Star Trek does that, just kill me.
Yeah.
I'm still the only person that doesn't like Star Trek 4 because of that.
Huh.
Not because of the whales. That's fine. I'm cool with the whales and the asteroid. Whatever. That all makes sense. But I don't want to see Kirk and Spock in the 1980s. I lived in the 1980s. I was there. That's not a magical journey. That going to a far, far away. I don't want to see that.
No, that's a fair call. No, I mean,
but getting back to Back to the Future, we've completely gone off of comic books. Did you notice that? Now we're just talking about movie sequels.
Yeah, no, we are.
We're wondering. But Back to the Future does the thing in the future, the goofy 2015 as the extension of 1985, which doesn't work at all, but it's hilarious. And then the movie kind of does time travel jumps, and then it goes back into the first movie.
Yep.
And it goes back through into the exact same scenes as the first movie, and the movie almost crawls up its own asshole without disturbing anything. Like, everything that happens in the first movie still happens. Right. Nothing gets disturbed, but it's like you're watching it from a different angle. And I love that.
No, that's a fun thing about Back to the Future 2, and I think it's also Back to the Future 2 and 3 kind of set up the template for in a lot of ways for like the modern movie trilogy, where you essentially have the first movie is a sort of a standalone sequel, and then you have
a standalone film,
and then a standalone film rather. We're gonna have to cut that, edit that.
No, we're leaving it in.
All right, fine, whatever. But basically the two movie, 2 and 3 basically end up being like one long movie that gets cut
in half,
somewhere,
kind of like Kill Bill.
Exactly.
Yes.
So, and I think a lot of films do that, and people are like, oh well, what about Star Wars? What about what do you call it?
Return of the Jedi.
And I was like, well, no, that's a standalone movie. I don't think The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi are like one big film that's cut in half. It's not.
It's more like there's a hook there. Mm-hmm. There's like a cliffhanger. There's a whole what do we do about Han Solo? But once that's resolved, then we just go right back to where we started. Right. So I think you're right about that. I think because
when you see it a lot, like you see it in a lot of movie franchises. One that springs to mind, of course, that is The Matrix 2 and 3, The Matrix Reloaded or whatever. I didn't really care for those.
No one did.
But exactly. some people if some friends of mine have basically been like, oh, you should go back and rewatch them. They held up, and I'm like, no, it's cool. I saw them once.
I had that experience with Dune.
Oh, wow.
Like, every 5 years, I try to rewatch Dune. It's like, maybe it'll be good this time. Because I like looking at Virginia Madsen. It'll work. No. That movie sucks.
Yeah, it's not
And
great.
I love Dune.
Yeah.
I will reread God Emperor of Dune every now and again just because I love that idea. That there's an infinite sandworm mine in a dude that's been living for 3,000 years and he's basically God and Emperor and knows all things, and then he dies.
I mean...
Spoilers. Spoilers on a book that came out in the 70s.
I'm curious to see the new adaptation that should be coming forth pretty soon. I think they just wrapped filming it, so maybe we'll do a future episode where we go and we watch it and sort of provide a review.
We can nerd out about Dune, because I have a lot of opinions about Dune.
Right on. All right. We'll put a
I have
in that
Dune
one for
opinions.
Later. All right.
I love Dune. And I actually follow the Dune Facebook group, the Dune fanbook group, and they're so excited. And they were really not happy when what's-his-name got cast as Duncan Idaho. Who am I thinking
Was that Jason Momoa?
Yeah, no. Jason Momoa.
Yeah.
And I kind of get that. Yeah. Because you kind of have to be sensitive with Dune castings, because sometimes you get Captain Picard as Gurney Halleck.
Right, no, that's true.
Which is not a good idea. But we're going to save this for a later episode. Andrew has opinions about Dune. Let's get back to comic book films.
So, let's talk a little bit about some adaptations of comic book films that, like, very clearly did not work. And you had mentioned From Hell before we started recording.
From Hell, yes. Which is possibly my favorite graphic novel of all time. There's going to be a lot of Alan Moore coming up.
Yeah.
A lot of Alan Moore. From Hell is amazing. It's not just a comic book or a graphic novel to me, if we want to make that distinction.
Okay.
But it's like it's a cinematic take on history.
Sure.
And everything that's in that graphic novel is entirely plausible, entirely grounded. He has sources to back up his suppositions, and at the same time he admits, I am pulling straws. I'm pulling a lot of this out of my ass. It's grounded and it's real, and this could exactly be it, but it could also be something completely different.
No, yeah, that's true, and I mean, it's a great example of historical fiction. From Hell is in many ways, and
if you're not familiar with it, From Hell is Alan Moore's graphic novel retelling of the Jack the Ripper killings, and it got made into a movie in 1997. talk about that movie in a second.
Do we have to?
We kind of do. It's kind of the theme of the night. But the premise of it is that it's the royal conspiracy. That Jack the Ripper was a royal conspiracy meant to silence a conspiracy of whores who had attempted to blackmail Queen Victoria due to the sexual peccadillos of Prince Christian Albert Victor, who was the eldest grandson of Queen Victoria.
Right, yeah, I think that was it.
He was the eldest son of Edward VIII, but he didn't become king because he died. He was the older brother of George V.
Right.
But he died before World War I.
Yeah, I believe so.
But he was, and I think he died of something like syphilis, but I could just be making that
I'm
up.
Shocked.
Syphilis in the Edwardian age?
Never.
Among the aristocracy? What? That didn't kill Winston Churchill's father. What are you talking about?
Yep.
And, and because of that, a doctor, William Withy Gull, who was a real historical figure, everyone you see in From Hell is a real historical person who really actually existed and was in that place in London in 1888. He was the one who butchered those women. He was Jack the Ripper. And the other thing I love about From Hell is that it explains where that title Jack the Ripper came from. That was just something the media made up.
Right.
The newspapers made that up.
Right.
No letter from the killer, and there were a couple of those, claiming to be, there was one that was obviously like a journalist fabrication. That's the one that signed it Jack the Ripper.
Right.
The one that historians and detectives think is authentic is the one that begins From Hell.
Mm.
Like, there was a third letter that went to the newspapers right before the last canonical Jack the Ripper killing that began From Hell. And historians and detectives that have looked into it, including John Douglas,
right,
the Mindhunter guy.
Yep.
He said this is the one people think is authentic, the one that begins From Hell, and there's a letter to it because it has like local Whitechapel information from it. It's not like a highly educated person's flight of fancy. It's like this is some stuff he's talking to people that only someone who lived in Whitechapel would have known about. So that's where the title comes from. It is a marvelous graphic novel if you have the stomach for it. It's weird. It's transcendental.
In some ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, it gets pretty weird. Yeah, I mean, it's the 19th century, so, opium's involved.
Yeah.
There's definitely that.
But the movie is none of those things.
No.
The movie is like, and we're talking like late 90s cinema, so it feels like, it's like watching Blade.
Yeah. Well, in some ways, yeah. I mean, this was that era of, like, Johnny Depp's career.
It was definitely peak Johnny Depp.
Yeah,
we're talking about
sure.
the 90s.
Well, and this was pre Pirates of the Caribbean.
Right.
And I think he, at that point, I can't remember if this was, if he did From Hell before or after Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, but I think it was the movie either before or after.
I want to say after.
Yeah, it was.
We could look that up, but...
Why? We're working from memory already. Why fuck up a good... Anyway.
We could look that up, but we're not going to. It was in that era.
But it's definitely, in that era where I think he was just sort of doing whatever, jobs appealed to him.
Now, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which is based on a book, that's a great movie.
Oh,
that's
fantastic.
Endlessly rewatchable because...
It's one of Terry Gilliam's better movies, to be frank.
And it's very... It gives you the feel of the book, but it's not slavishly devoted to the book.
No,
it cuts the entire, last quarter of the book out, and thank God, because the last quarter of that book is miserable and depressing.
Yeah.
It's just miserable.
Well, and he does use he does get to use, the last line from the book about midway through the movie. I believe that's the last line. It's been a minute since I read it, but Yeah, he does get to use
I've
the
got it up here
and you
somewhere.
saw the high water mark, and I was like, oh yeah.
Oh yeah, that's a great.
Yeah,
That whole thing and the way it's
you know,
it's able to do things that it's able as a movie to do things that a book can't do. So it's a good example of a movie that is able to build off a book and make it something better. Instead of just like having him tell you about what the 60s are like, Terry Gilliam's able to visualize that high water mark.
Yep.
We're able to visualize, what it was like to do acid.
Right.
You can have Hunter Thompson tell you what it's like to do acid,
Or
and he does a pretty good job of it, but you can see it.
You can have Gilliam just show you Hunter S. Thompson doing acid. And
Doing acid and the mind snapping through an acid flashback. Not an acid flashback.
Well, I mean, there is a flashback where he's on acid, so I mean, like, I don't know. But
It kind of is, yeah.
Narratively, it's an acid
Narratively,
flashback,
it doesn't matter. But that's a good example. But From Hell ends up being like a straightforward pot boiler. There's like one or two scenes in it that have the feel of the graphic novel, like when the first victim is killed.
That is
in the graphic novel, everything stops on that image, and that image just sits there through like 3 or 4 frames before some workmen on their way to work at 4:30 in the morning find the body.
Right.
And they're like, oh, we better go find a cop. And they go find a cop. And this is all taken directly from the police reports, as John Douglas's book explains. And then people just start coming into the frame around this woman who's been gutted. And that's the only thing in the movie that feels like the book. It's just like that.
Right.
The woman's in frame, and then people just start coming into the frame, and that's when the media frenzy happens. But everything else is like, even though it has the same protagonist, the same antagonist, the same conspiracy, it just feels like a collection of jump scares.
Yeah.
And that raises the question of, why do this movie based on this graphic novel?
Yeah, I don't know.
Which is really the question that we're trying to get into tonight. Why create this?
Maybe an answer to that could be some of the mini-series or the TV shows where they actually try to adapt some of these stories for the small screen. Like a very recent example is Garth Ennis's The Boys that Amazon has picked up.
I keep hearing all about that.
So... it's not... That actually might be an example of something that does work as an adaptation, because fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of Garth Ennis' stuff is completely unfilmable.
How so?
It's pretty grotesque. Like, there's some stuff...
That even happens for Amazon?
There's some stuff... There was actually a scene that they filmed for Amazon for the show that they then ended up cutting, which is where Homelander basically gets reprimanded by, the top brass because all the, superheroes are essentially corporate employees. Mm-hmm. So he goes up to the top of the Chrysler building and starts jerking off. And he's just saying, like, I can do whatever I want. I can do whatever I want. And he just, like, spooges on the city. So apparently Amazon actually shot that. Pun intended. And then the powers that be at Amazon were like, no, fuck no.
We can't actually do that.
You can't do that. And they were like, oh, well, all right. And they cut it. And the showrunner was like, had nothing but praise for the actor. He was like, no, he was a total professional. He did a great job.
You ever notice that when they tell you you're a total professional, it's because you did something you really shouldn't do?
Yeah, exactly. But apparently that was
really professional about the way he jerked off.
Yeah, but like
he did that like a pro.
It's like this guy practices at home. Yeah. But it was this sort of situation with the show where it's definitely true to the spirit. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, it does not follow exactly to the core, this comic, because it essentially can't. It's too raunchy, it's too gory, and I think that's a thing that comics can kind of do, that you can't always do in film, that you can't always do, on TV. And I mean, this is obviously also true for literature, for novels. There are things that are, just you can't put it on screen. There are certain things that really only work within a given medium, and you just like, to me, you can't, it just doesn't always translate. You just can't always do it.
Yeah. It's funny you think about that, because From Hell is certainly a violent movie.
Oh, absolutely.
There's lots of stabbings, lots of women being stabbed.
Yep. No, that happens.
And fast.
Yep.
Like almost at like the speed of reality.
Uh-huh.
But there was still a lot of things from the graphic novel that weren't able to translate. Like, wasn't able to and it's, you took this thing, and we should probably predicate this by recognizing the fact that making any kind of film is a supremely difficult endeavor.
Oh, and expensive.
Expensive and difficult. Like,
oh, yeah.
To create a shot in a series of shots that tell a narrative requires supreme focus.
Yep. And
lots of equipment and wherewithal and attention. And it's a monumental endeavor, whereas, a comic book requires 2 people.
Yeah, or sometimes
even less than that.
Sometimes just one person.
But yeah, but so there's an ease of imagination, I think, with a one-man creation versus an army required to shoot a film.
No, absolutely, and I think it's when you have sort of printed matter, whether it's a book or a comic, the pacing is, in some ways, it's how long it takes the audience to absorb the material is less important than, say, a TV show or a movie. You have an allotted amount of time, and we always hear about scenes that end up on the cutting room floor for movies and things like that. For TV shows, certainly, and editing takes a big role in the production of those shows and in the production of that medium.
That was the sound of beer getting drunk.
Yes. Oh, you think I was going to do this sober?
Unlikely.
Yeah.
So From Hell just took a incredibly complex graphic novel and turned it into something Hollywood.
No, exactly.
Which, when you put it that way, it's really not surprising. No. So,
but it's hard to preserve the complexity, and I think that's really our gripe there, is that you have a pretty brilliant take by Alan Moore on the whole sort of Jack the Ripper saga, and then it just sort of gets turned into a Hollywood,
a pretty standard thing,
pot boiler, by the numbers, sort of mystery movie.
Mystery
thriller.
of the week, thriller. What is the point of making it?
Yeah, and
it's and let's be honest and say that making money off of something, entertainment, it's an industry.
Sure.
People have to get paid.
Sure.
People have to get paid, or else no more movies get made.
Sure.
So they're obviously trying to make money. So I think, if it's when that's it.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
When that's it and nothing more, that you have that problem. Like you can make something that's purely for the quick buck, purely for the exploitative, but doesn't have to be.
Sure.
Like, I would never... We were talking about the Marvel movies a second, but I would never say that those are purely take a buck.
Oh, yeah.
And these are massive Hollywood blockbusters that large multinational corporations are depending on for their bottom line.
Mm-hmm.
But I would never say they're made in a schlocky or exploitative way. And I think the fact that people like them as much as they do, and people get into them as much as they do, and love them as much as they do, is testament to that.
Oh, no, certainly. And I mean, and I think that in some ways, the success of the Marvel movies and how they've adapted a lot of their source material is sort of proof of our thesis in some ways, just because they don't necessarily try to do a straight adaptation of any of the actual comics.
They're making a movie,
right?
here's some characters that will make neat movies. Let's make movies out of them.
Right.
Like the Marvel movies are movies.
Right.
And they're entertaining movies because the people who wrote them and directed them care about making a quality movie.
Right.
Which gets really to the hub of the question, like what makes a movie good versus what makes a graphic novel good.
No, yeah.